What did you do? Yeah. And there's like, I think I have this one. Yeah, see that? And then we
Yeah.
discovered with, was it AJ that discovered, did something
Hmm.
like this?
Yeah, it's so funny. Yesterday
There we
I
go.
was yesterday I was talking to Ed. I was something like this. Just I wasn't making thumbs up, but I was like this, and I
Yeah.
saw this thumbs up. I
Oh, it's
really
too
love
good.
this new feature. I
um,
think that's their heart, right? Yeah,
yeah,
it
yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah. Nice. And there's more of them. You should read about how to trigger them.
Yeah, such a useful feature.
Yeah, okay, so last time I did, I think, yeah, I just verified that it worked. Yeah, because you weren't part of, like, I updated the packages. So now we
Hmm.
have, so now we have like an impact signal package and impact context package. And I'm waiting for GitHub
Mm,
to give me the impact npm scope.
cool.
Um, and I also fixed what we talked about. I think that was in our branch that we had. Oh, it's in Git. Yeah, we had this observe where we
Hmm.
were setting the suggested commit message and we were also reading the suggested commit message. So it would run this code first, start observing changes to the suggested commit message, and then we would set the value, which just re-triggers the observer, and then it sees that we start observing the suggested commit message and we set it again, and then it just goes into a loop. Um,
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
and the fix was really that when you observe something and you change a signal, um, you can't observe that signal.
Hmm.
And like the idea is that you don't think about that. Like this is the code we actually wrote, and we didn't think about that, and then it would normally work.
Hmm.
So uh, yes.
Uh, can I ask something
Mm-hmm.
completely unrelated to this?
Okay.
But I just saw something that probably you already figured out. But we have observer and we have observe.
Yeah.
It's don't you think it might be confusing for a Surface API? Like
Yeah.
just one letter can make so different things in your
Exactly.
application. It might be
Yeah.
confusing.
Yeah.
Especially when you have auto import inside VS Code, and it
Mm-hmm.
might easily lead you import using the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Because before that observe thing was available, like this thing, uh, this was actually called observe, using observe.
Mhm.
Um, and then like the problem, the real problem is that everyone else calls it an effect, which is really what it is. Like, so you
Mhm.
would write effect here. Um, but I didn't want that to conflict with React's use effect. But maybe that's a good thing because it's called use effect in React, and it basically has the same functionality. It's just a reactive effect as opposed to a like reconciliation dependency array effect.
Mhm.
So maybe we should just call it effect.
Yeah, as I said, because this is what this function is really is. It's some kind of a use effect, but a different behavior.
Yeah.
It's not a hook. It's not a React primitive, but
Mhm.
it's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah. And it
And
aligns
my
with the others as well.
yeah, my biggest point here is that might be confusing if you use observe and observer.
Yeah, I agree. Uh, let's just fix that. Oh, I really like how this is kind of coming together.
Yeah,
Like these small iterations, like okay, we have a new badge for new editor versions, and then we have this notification, and now like everything's kind of coming together. What did we observe? Yeah, let's rename it to effect. Seamless branching. It's
yeah.
amazing.
And I think effect is it make it become more intuitive to use. Like
Yeah,
I wish I want to use a use effect, but I can't. So okay, effect.
yeah,
I think it makes more sense.
yeah. I agree. I agree.
Uh,
I guess that's it.
you need to change the import. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's a really good. That's really good feedback. And as you said, like we don't want to like we're not introducing like new conceptual. Well, what's the right term? Like we're not introducing something new that React can't do. It's the same thing, but instead of state, it's signal, and instead of
Mhm.
use effect, it's effect. Like you want to do the same things, but in a way more performant and straightforward way. So
Yeah. The only problem about the effect, the term effect, is that if what about if you React decides to implement signals, and then
yeah,
probably they will call effect.
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, have you? Is there any documentation on this? I heard about this that React is like looking into signals. Uh,
Yeah, I think they are considering. Not sure.
yeah,
I know
one
that
thing.
they have been working on a compiler that would be a big boost performance for a React application,
Yeah, the
but
forget thing. The forget.
forget. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not sure about signals.
yeah. Uh, but what's really cool that I didn't know about Preact signals? Where are they? Preact signals. Um, is that I don't know if you remember, but I talked about Solid and how Solid has signals,
Hmm.
but Solid doesn't have this concept where a component, like the component body, doesn't rerun every time a signal within the component changes. You have to use a signal in the JSX syntax. And then
Mm,
the good thing about that is like if you use a signal here, um, it means that only the actual P reconciles.
hmm.
Um, but the problem is that what if you want to do switch statements and return different UI, or you want just if statements and return different UI? You can't do that with Solid. You have to use these special JSX or special components called switch and all this stuff,
Mm,
which doesn't work with typing and so on. So it kind of breaks you out of a very natural thing, which is to use the language. um, but what's really cool about Preact is that if first of all components just has observing by default. So like with impact and React, you have to do the using keyword to kind of trigger the observing in the component. But in
hmm.
Preact, that just works. And then if you were to access a signal like this, um, you're accessing the value in the component body, then it will reconcile the whole counter component in this case. But what you can also do, you can actually put, yeah, oh, nice, you see it here. You can actually put the actual signal
Oh,
as into this, and now only the P actually reconciles, which is really interesting. So you get the best of both worlds. You can have like super surgical updates of the DOM, or you can
very
have component
granular.
updates. Yeah. It's really, really
Oh,
cool.
I didn't notice, but the first place, but this you define the signal outside of the component scope, right?
Yeah, and
Oh,
that's the thing. Like I saw this presentation. I think it was what's his name? The solid guy. I call him Carleone because he has like an Italian last name. Uh, but yeah, he talked to someone. I can't remember. And then yeah, to the other guy, the Theo. Is his name Theo? He's insanely like his YouTube channel. It's like it's insane how many people is following him.
as I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and they talked about like Carleone would put the signal inside the component first, and they talked about like how the component doesn't the component body doesn't execute again, it just executes once, and like the mental model is much simpler, which I totally agree with. But then they gave the example like, okay, so if you want global state, you can just move the signal, you can just literally move the line of code outside of the component, and then it works exactly the same, but now you have global state, which is also great for like the mental model. um, the problem though is that how do you organize that? Like
Mhm.
that's the thing. Like where do you actually define this global state, and how do you um, like encapsulate it and um, make it discoverable, and all of these challenges of just organizing state and managing state, and where do you put your logic? Like if you have data fetching and updating a signal, like where do you do that? And there's a ton of questions that pop up. It's not just
Uh-huh.
moving the signal into your global scope. um, Anyways, but it's really cool. It's really, really cool, and I would love for React to just do what Preact does. You have a signal
Yeah.
and you can consume it in the component body accessing the value, or you can just shove the signal directly into an element, and then
Mhm.
it's like surgical.
Because by doing this way, okay, this is a very raw idea, but then you don't need to use context. You don't need to use pass pass down props, for example, to consume as a global state.
Yeah.
You can simply import the signal in your component, and if you understood correctly, this component will react or will update based on this signal change.
Yeah.
And this is such a simpler API than using context. I know there are different challenges, different technologies,
Hmm.
but the development experience it seems better using this approach.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It's
as you
much.
said, there are others challenges like how you organize your global state. But I can see the benefits of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And like we talked about previously as well, like you don't have to scope your state to like component trees. Like if you get so far just having all your state global, and then like here you just get it out of the box. You just, as you said, you have to figure out which file do you want to have them in, and how do you define the methods or functions for changing that state. But that's not like a huge challenge, that's just an open question. And then, as you say, you can just consume this in all your components. So I guess like the only thing, yeah, the only problem with that is that, but it becomes global. Like you can't like instantiate state for a component tree, for example. You still get into this case where you want to fetch some data for a page, for example, and then you have to do
Mhm,
that globally. You have to fetch the data, and then you have to instantiate that data, and then when you consume that signal in the component, the data might be there or it might not be there, kind of issue.
mhm.
um, but but it's but it's really, really, yeah, it just simplifies a ton
Yeah,
because you don't.
yeah. So
Yeah.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like it's kind of insane how you have like use memo and use callback and all of this stuff, and it's and then you have like forget thing they're working on, the compiler that basically
Mm-hmm.
just creates those things for you. But when you have this reactive paradigm, you don't need those things. Like it can still be immutable. um like you can't mutate signals, you have to replace the value of a signal, so you still follow that model, you just don't have all this memorization stuff on top,
Mm-hmm.
and dependency arrays and all of that. It's such a mental overload.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe we are missing some some piece of information of why I don't know why the React community didn't go for this solution.
It's a good question. I think so. Okay, so my theory is that reactivity has always been mutable. So you could always just go in, just like MobX, you can just go in and change something. And this has been true for um, like Angular. Remember Angular coming out?
Mm-hmm.
And all these solutions that has this reactive paradigm. They're mutable. And then React kind of took a swing. And then, no, we're going to do the complete opposite. We're going to make it immutable and then have this really efficient reconciliation. And that makes things more predictable, and you can do all sorts of cool stuff. And then now we're starting to figure out that, oh, but you can still have an immutable reconciliation with signals that Preact is showing here. So with
Mm-hmm.
everything, like maybe the answer isn't mutable reactivity or immutable reconciliation. It's like immutable reactivity type of thing.
Yeah. Hmm.
Hmm.
Sorry to for deviating the conversation, but it
No,
was a great conversation to
yeah,
understand the
but this
signals.
is this is super interesting, and we're right in the middle of this now. There's something brewing, and um, yeah, and it has so it's really hard to miss what's happening. Like solid JS looks so much like React, but it's fundamentally different how it doesn't have the reconciliation loop. And then you have React,
Mm-hmm.
which only has the reconciliation loop. And then you have Preact, which has both signals and a reconciliation loop. Um, and yeah, and it heavily affects what you can do and how you express things and how performant it is. And yeah. Mm, cool.
Cool.
Yes. Where were we? Oh, yeah. So I fixed that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm sorry that and I just went through and refactored a bit. So I made like folders out of I think we talked about this last time as well. Like you have these contexts and they can be very big. Like it depends on how much needs to be shared. But they can become quite big, and then like how would you organize uh,
Mm-hmm.
and separate it? So here I made it a folder, and then I'm returning like create router and create API, and it basically um, has the same code. It's just that it's namespaced basically, which is which is fine. I got a little bit annoyed or hung up. Was it on the branch context? I think. Um, yeah. So I got a little bit annoyed here because here I created a layout namespace and I created a Git namespace, but now I had to pass in picture and the layout. So it's like it's very explicit dependency. And then in Git, I would have to, okay, how would I then type the layout? Well, I have to return type of create layout. And it's just, in the old model, I could just say use layout and you would just get it. It would be injected for you.
Hmm.
So yeah, I was.
What? Why do you need a layout inside Git?
It's the sidebar,
Just curious.
current sidebar
Sidebar.
panel. Yeah,
Sure.
and then you can do
Okay.
things like that's the thing. It becomes more of an open question. Like, how do you want to pass these dependencies around, or what kind of patterns and guidelines do you want? Maybe a guideline could be okay if what the hell? Oh, it's my mother. uh, if you have like two different, let's call them namespaces, being Git and layout here, if one of them depends on the other, move that logic here. So you would put the observe here because it requires both of them. Like that could be like a guideline. But just having to
Hmm.
create these guidelines, and even here, like I chose to use an object, but you could pass multiple arguments. Maybe you didn't pass the whole layout. Maybe you would just pass like a signal. Like there's so many opportunities on how you can do it.
Yeah, it's very flexible. Like there is no requirement. It's just JavaScript at the end.
Yeah, and that's a good thing, but it's also like yeah, I don't like it because it just you have to make these opinions and you have to make those opinions as a team. And then someone might implement it one way and then someone might implement it a different way. Again, it's just JavaScript though.
Hmm.
But yeah, it made me itch a little bit. um, cool. But that's basically what I did. I just refactored those contexts, and I call it like um, create branches. So here also I called it branch first, but then calling it a branch conflicted with the branch property coming from a parent component. So then I called it branches, and I was thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean that maybe this isn't a good idea, or like all these questions?
Yeah, I can see the problem about create branches, which sounds to me like an action.
Yeah,
Like I want to create a branch.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that was the second thing. Is like I'm calling them create namespace, but it's like should I call it initialize branches? But still, it sounds like you're initializing branches while you're really creating the API
Hmm.
for dealing with branches. So should I call it create branches API? But then we would have what would I do with API? Should I call it create API API? It's like it's oh my god.
Um, I don't know, just a few ideas. Maybe create branch context,
Yeah,
create init branch context.
yeah. I think that makes sense. That would be the most correct thing because you're composing contexts together.
Hmm.
Um,
Um, set context branch, set branch to context. I don't know,
yeah.
maybe.
No, I think yeah, I like that the most. But another thing that's also a little bit confusing with this is that where was that? Was it with branches? Yeah. So when I built this the first time, I was trying to pass. I need like you need the API from the global context here. And what I did first is that I would try to pass it in as an argument. But then I realized like running this function runs in the scope of creating the context. So I can just use global context here. But it wasn't directly intuitive to me that I could do that because I'm like in a different function in a different file. I'm not like looking at um, I'm not like looking at the actual context. Like I'm not saying
You,
that it's bad. It's just yeah, it wasn't perfectly intuitive.
I can see, yeah, it's not intuitive that now you can use a hook inside uh, inside
Yeah,
this create factory function,
yeah.
and it's indeed very counterintuitive.
It could help. just calling them the same thing. So you just call it branches context, and then you kind of
And
have the same thing. But this also looks a little bit weird.
and why not a hook? Like use great branch context. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, because there is something about the previous API where you would compose these stores together, and these stores could just use each other. It made so much sense. So they could use each other, and any component could use either of the stores. But here we make sure that we expose the context as a single point. Like you consume like the session context, and if you dot into that context, you have branches, you have picture, and so on. So I did reflect on like, oh my god, come on. So like, what if context was like this? So you would say branches context and picture context,
Mhm.
or like you would do this. Like you could use namespaces. It was part of the API to use namespaces, and then inside branches context. Uh, that's the thing. Like it just extends the API, which I don't like. But then you would have something like, okay, here you would get like the, yeah, what would you do with props here, for example? Like, would you merge the props for each? Because there's one provider. So would you merge the props of each context?
I can see what you mean. Yeah.
Like you could do that, but it just adds a lot of questions. And then like, and then you would have
Mhm.
like because this one is like use some context, and then how would you then consume the picture context? Like picture, would you use context and then import the function? Like it just, there's so many questions about how you would do this.
But instead of okay, branches context doesn't return a JSX, right? It's not a a React component,
Oh
right?
no, sorry, yeah, it's just a context, yeah.
It's just a context. So in my opinion, I think it makes more sense to wrap this in a React hook because it only abstract the
Oh
logic inside of and then you could still have you could have use branch context and then yeah maybe can I jump in this branch
yeah.
then maybe I can explain my idea.
um it's impact exploration. I don't have any way to give you the link.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm
Oh
there.
nice. By the way, I'm just going to write down something I thought about when you
Mm-hmm. What is
um,
the file you are user context? Oops.
Oh yeah.
I
Yeah,
was
exactly.
thinking something like this, and then here you can pass the specifically the props you need for this branches context.
Yeah. The only Yeah, that makes sense because I remember like in the previous version you would be able to use um like when you use a store, you can use that store in a store or in a component. So it actually checks like what's your where is it running, which is more similar here. The only thing that's a challenge here is that the hooks, they don't take props. It's the provider that takes the props. Oh no, you mean like just oh sorry, you mean like so you wouldn't actually it would just be a function.
Hmm.
Oh yeah, so
Yeah,
you wouldn't
exactly.
define this as a context. It would just be like oh sorry. It would just be like use branch context. And then you would return it like this.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just a function.
Yeah.
And then for me, it becomes more intuitive that inside
Yeah.
this function, I can use whatever context I want.
Exactly.
Like what was the example you were reusing? I think the API.
Yeah, API from the global context.
Yeah, it's a global context.
Yeah.
So now it makes more clear for me that I can use it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and that's the simplest way because this is only about it's basically what you name the function. Uh,
Yeah, it is about the development experience. It's not
hmm,
um, like I maybe technically they are different. You
hmm.
could do different ways, but it's just about how we are going to work with this function, how we are going to educate ourselves to
Yeah,
use the right abstraction.
exactly.
And
And what I also like about this is that terminology I haven't used until I started working on this project is the hooks pattern. Like React introduced this, the hooks pattern. And it's just how you kind of think about function composition. Um, and that's what we're doing here. Like we're using the hook, like the hooks pattern in React is like it's related to like the reconciliation loop, and you're in the context of the component, so you can use these special hooks that is like use state and use effect that has like specific meaning to React. But at the end of the day, it's a way to think about composing functions together.
yeah, totally.
And that's what we're doing here as well. We're just composing them together. Yeah, I like this because I was
Yeah.
thinking like what if you look below here, I started overthinking it, I think. uh so that what if you actually did create different contexts here, where you could choose like normally this would be use branches context. Maybe I can just call them that, like use picture
Hmm.
context. And then the context function has a composition interface, so you would kind of do this.
Hmm. But
But then
you,
it's a little bit
you you would end up with the same problem where you need to merge the props, right? The
yes,
props.
yes, because then it will merge the props. Yeah, that's true. So I like yours better. uh,
Yeah, it's idea. You can polish.
yeah. But this is good. Let's do it. Let's just do it for this one, just to kind of see. Take a look.
Hmm.
Um, and then yup, yup. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Um, so yeah, I refactored that. Did I do anything else? No, yeah, sorry, I we created like this async function. It was more to show that like how would you use async functions uh,
Mm-hmm.
with observe. I just moved it back because I wanted to contain it within the observe. That's also, it's also interesting. It really ties into like procedural programming as well, where you can have like these really big functions, like it can be hundreds of lines of code.
Mm-hmm.
But you need ways to like still encapsulate things, and like how do you use comments, how do you use like block scopes to encapsulate, and um
How did
that
you
I
call it?
hmm?
Progressive? Progressive function? How
Oh,
did you call it?
procedural programming.
Procedure.
Yeah, it's, oh, I built this really interesting proof of concept, or it was just an exploration using picture client. So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about picture client, it's such a good example of how you can approach programming, because with picture client now, it's like you instantiate one class and then it instantiates everything that is picture client, and you can dive into like dot into that class instance and you can explore everything. But with procedural programming, or like procedural functional programming, I guess is the correct term, you would not do that. You would maybe create a connection, and then you would have these different functions like send or maybe commit, for example, or git status, get git status. So you would have a
Mm-hmm.
function called get git status, and you would pass the connection in as the first argument, for example. And then you write out all the logic for grabbing the git status there. And so you kind of, and git status is maybe a bad example, but because it's not complicated to go and grab the git status, but you can have very complicated things like, do I have a good example? Yeah, I don't think I really have a good example. But the point is that you don't use like classes and methods to separate logic. You just write everything out in one function, and that function has a responsibility, and all its responsibilities is just defined in that function, kind of thing. Or at least that's how I understand it.
Interesting.
Um,
I will read more about it. I'm curious.
yeah. And I think maybe the best example of this is also Firebase, because
Mm-hmm.
Firebase, they moved away from having like an instance of an app where you had everything available, while now you create, for example, a collection reference, and then you have like get docs, and you pass it a collection reference, and um, it's a very different way. They do it, I think they do it because it just became too big. Like you didn't use all the functionality behind the app instance, and there was a
Mm-hmm.
ton of logic there. So this was a way for them to allow you to just import the functionality you use and then compose it together.
I see. Interesting.
But
Cool.
yeah, I guess it's a little bit confusing. Like what's the functional part and what's the procedural part? Like the functional part is that you have just have a function, you don't have like a class instance, and you give it like what it needs to operate itself. And the procedural part, the way I understand it, is that you just write down all the responsibilities directly in the function. You don't have like references to methods on the class instance and stuff like that. You just, yeah, just write it.
Cool.
Mm, what were we doing? Oh, uh, yes, yeah, it was the async thing. Yeah, so it was just me thinking, instead of having like two separate things, the observe and the async function, you just have the observe, and then everything is right in there. I'm not saying that's like the correct thing. I was just um, playing around with how to like, because this is in a sense like very procedural is probably the wrong term, but the point is that we have a function, and within that function scope we just define a bunch of stuff. We define some signals, we define some variables, we define some effects, and how would you organize that? Like, how would you keep it clean? What should be at the top? What should be next? Where do you express cleanup and like all that stuff? Yes. And then the other reflection I had was we used to say get status, or we said git status before. What I realized is that when you use a getter with a promise, it creates some ambiguity about what is it. Because if you have like get title and you have like a title title signal, it's like it's synchronous. You expect it to be the title. And then if you have if you point to status, you kind of expect it to be the status. You don't expect it to be a promise. But if you name it fetch status, you have more of, or at least me personally, I have more an expectation that, okay, this is going to return a promise.
Yeah, get a promise. And why do you need to define a getter in the first place for this values?
Why I need to do this?
Yes. Why do we need the getters?
It's because it's just like there's two ways we can expose signals. We could just expose the signal itself, but then when you consume it in a component, some component, there are like two. This is more of a how we think about programming and how important it is with private and public access. So what was it? Status promise, like use, I just git context, just doing this. So now you have a status promise, but you have to do value to access the actual promise. So that's one thing. It's like you have to dot value to actually access it. But now you're also allowed to change it. So if you use a getter, you do two things. You return a read only. This becomes, if you hover this, it becomes read only. And you're not able to change it from the outside because it's a getter. And we still access the value, so it tracks. So if a component does this, it will start tracking that status because the getter accesses the value of the signal.
Like it creates a new reference for this value. Is that correct?
You can think about it as like the problem here is that we're destructuring, which makes it confusing. So if I do git context.status, what literally happens is that it calls this function by the sheer fact that I'm doing dot status. Yeah.
Sure.
And implicitly, that's also what's happening when you're destructuring. It's like you're dotting into the status implicitly, and this function runs.
Great. Yeah, it makes more sense now for me why we are using getters.
Cool. But yeah, so, and I think that makes a ton of sense in, for example, in branch context. Like we're returning the ID, we're returning the owner. This is synchronously accessible state. It makes a ton of sense to use a getter for that. But then you have this promise that might be resolved or might not be resolved. So, for example, with branches, like it makes a ton of sense that you call that fetch, because here we are literally, every time we consume this, we are actually fetching the branch. What's different about our git status is that we immediately go and get the status. So it's already a pending promise. But by calling it fetch status, we make it more obvious in the component that this is actually a promise you're consuming. And then it feels like you can see how it works here. So you say like use git fetch status, and then you get the git
Yeah,
status.
that's cool. Really
But
cool.
yeah, was just thinking and reflecting, and it's funny to me like having lower level APIs. There's so much more up to the team to figure out like how to name things and have their own opinions about things, and that's great in one sense. But like people have different opinions about like naming and what makes sense.
Yeah, but I can see now this is in a very good shape, and we have this proof of concept. And I was wondering maybe, yeah, next week I think Alex will join, right?
Mhm.
And then we can start to create a feature from scratch,
Yeah,
and again get his feedback and his perspective
yeah,
about this API.
exactly. Yeah, I wanted to. Maybe we can do that all in one session. I wanted to try first to just ask him to look at this folder and just go through it and reason about what he's seeing,
Hmm.
and just let him. Of course, he'll obviously like stop at certain points and ask about, oh, what's a signal. Um, but that, of course, that's obvious. But at the same time, I'm more interested in like how he thinks about like navigating the folders and the file tree. And
Yeah, the file tree kind of like it because it reflects the the tree, like
yeah,
how deep is a hook and what depends what. Like it's clear for me that at some way branch it's assembly or it depends on the session. Oh no, yeah, it depends on the session because it's inside of the session.
hmm,
So it's very clear for me.
yeah,
And then we have user global context, which is high up of a branch. So
hmm,
it's also clear for me that I can use global context inside the branch.
hmm,
And today in the CodeSandbox application, we have this confusion about what is the which kind of a context I can use in each component.
yeah,
And it's very frustrating because we don't have a clear answer.
yeah,
We kind of need to first import the hook and see if it throws an error. And then we clearly know that we are using this hook in the wrong place.
yeah,
And
exactly.
in the
It's
other side,
yeah,
in the other hand, like we have this flat organization, which is cool. Like I can easily find a component or a hook,
yeah,
but it doesn't reflect the real hierarchy that we have in the application.
yeah, exactly. And that's a really good point. It's like if if you come from the perspective where I need to know about all the hooks we have in this app, then it's really nice to have a flat hooks folder, because then it
Hmm.
literally just shows you all the hooks that exists. But if you think about the nature of a hook, they can only be used. Well, of course it depends on the hook. Like some hooks can be used like anywhere, but other hooks they are like tied to the component tree because they're using a context or something. And then it becomes problematic. Like if it's flat, where the hell can I use this thing? And that's a more
Hmm.
important thing. Just I think it was yesterday or the day before, Eva's mentioned to me he created a couple of new hooks, and that's like I can so like relate to that, and I feel really good when I create like a hook abstraction. But
Hmm.
then the problem is like, how does anyone else understand that? First of all, that I just added this hook, and then uh, where can they actually use the hook?
Hmm.
Um,
I think the biggest problem in our application is that uh, our hooks are context hooks. They are
Yes.
not they
Yes.
are not usually functional hooks,
Hmm.
which doesn't depend on the rest of doesn't depend on anything. And
Exactly.
we you use hooks to abstract context
Yeah.
um, co- context things. And that's the problem we are facing
Yeah.
now with the CodeSandbox application. But if
Exactly.
in this new approach, we have a clear distinction. What is a context hook and
Yeah.
what is a functional hook?
Yeah.
And we can keep this flat
Yeah.
folder with a bunch of hooks, and it becomes very discoverable.
Yeah. Exactly. That's the exact problem. Like we have context hooks, and they are also, and some of them, and that's also interesting. Like some of these hooks are using context hooks, but features are, by its definition, it's a context hook. Like that's what
Yeah.
we, that's a feature. It's something that wraps more than a component. Um, but it's flat, right? So we don't know which can use which, and
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. It's really, really interesting. But yeah, I totally agree with your summary. It's like you get so much more information from the file tree about what can be used where, and just things like um, being able to, for example, with the session context, being able to give it a key and then know that, okay, at this point in the application, we're able to dictate exactly when it should like flush out everything. So in this case, whenever the authentication changes, we want to remount the whole thing. We want to remove all the state and everything that was happening on the previous session, and just using that key as an indicator of changing out the context of the app. Like I think context hasn't been embraced enough as like a concept in React. It's more like a mechanism to provide a value in the component tree, as opposed to being an actual conceptual context around the component tree. Because we've mostly been using it for like theme provider or
Yeah, cool. But it's important that we are addressing these issues now.
yep, yep, yep.
Um, it's a plan. At least we have a plan.
Yes. And I'll refactor these things to use branches, like the hooks pattern, or hooks naming, at least hooks pattern naming. And then we'll ask Alex to go through it, and then yeah, I liked your idea about like try to create a feature with him. um,
um, yeah. What if we just create a hook folder inside Impact Exploration? Just to, I don't know, just to remind us that these, if you want to add, for example, util functions or hooks, that they are function hooks, just to remember us that there is a difference between
oh yeah,
context and functional hooks.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it makes sense like to have those flat, because they're, each hook is tied to the component where you use them, so it doesn't have any context to them. Like they don't care where they're being used. It makes sense to have them flat. And then
Mhm.
yeah, exactly.
Cool. Yeah, let me add, I don't know, just use the functional, yes, something like this.
Yeah, use date now.
Yeah, like they are functional hooks. They don't depend of anything.
Yeah, exactly. Use git. Use git. Use git. Use layout. Uh, Cool. Nice. Yeah, this was a lot of conceptual talk, but that means we're kind of getting. It's more about, yeah, our personal opinions, and that's what I kind of hope this becomes. Is like you have this very simple reactive primitives, like a reactive context and a reactive signal, and then we apply our like opinions on top of that. Like how do we name things? How do we structure
Mhm.
things? How do we take advantage of all of this stuff? How do we enable? How do we approach optimistic updates? How do we approach doing the data fetching between the boundaries of the context and all of this is just like patterns that we're kind of creating together, and then that can sit as an example, but it doesn't block anyone from creating new patterns and have other opinions
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, agree.
and it's much better to have like an ecosystem of like low level um, powerful primitives, and then the conversation becomes more about like what patterns you apply on top of it, instead of like I created this abstraction which has this API, and if you use that, then you have to like use this library, as opposed to we're all using these same core primitives, and then these are our patterns, and then if you see someone using a better pattern, you can just change what you're doing because you're using the same low level stuff.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, it makes
that's
sense.
yeah, and that's something I've learned. Like it's fun making abstractions and APIs, and just in code, like just writing code, creating abstractions is fun, right? You kind of
Yeah.
yeah build something, and then you just have this one function where you give it some options, and it does a shit ton of different stuff, and you feel good about that. And then someone comes in, and then oh, but it needs to do this other thing, and then you have to refactor the whole thing, and it's just a mess.
Yeah. When I was working on Setback and maintaining stuff there, it's very easy to get distracted by requests, feature requests,
Mhm.
and then you think, okay, once again, I need to redesign the API, but you you have to find the right balance.
Yeah.
What is can be reused by everyone, and what is this user is just trying to solve their problem.
Mhm.
And then maybe you need to provide a generic API which is flexible enough to empower this user to make their own solution
Yeah.
instead of trying to solve all the minor solutions. And it's such a great challenging to find this balance
Yeah.
in making flexible and generic API, but also we don't want to expose it too much how
Yeah.
the application works. So it's amazing challenging.
It's yeah, it's really interesting because I had a conversation yesterday with some people who's worked on Overmind, um, and it yeah points to what you're saying is like the power of abstraction is that you can simplify how to do something. So, for example, in the case of Overmind, you have like three very simple concepts. You have like effects, state, and actions, and that helps people to think about the complexity of building an application because you have to manage state, and to manage
Mhm.
state you have to call actions, and you have effects. You don't only change state, you have effects like fetching data and everything. So you have like the highest abstraction of the three things you need to deal with building any application, and that helps people to get going building an application. But then, as you say, you learn more about what it means to build an application, and you start creating some opinions, and you want to explore different patterns. And then if you're stuck with like three APIs like state, effect, and action, then you're kind of stuck with that, and it's hard to do anything with it. It's almost like maybe all tools should have two layers of API. So you have like the low level layer that you build first for maximum flexibility, and then you have the opinionated abstraction on top, which is, yeah, higher abstraction, which is where the aim is not flexibility, it's conceptual understanding of like using the lower level primitives kind of thing.
Yeah,
And then
it's interesting.
yeah, because then it depends on your, as you said, like how much do you understand. Like maybe you'll start with the higher abstraction API to learn about it and understand it and become productive, but then as you learn more about it, you might flip to the lower level
Yeah,
API to solve certain things.
yeah, I can see this how we build a React application. Like you could simply use state, use effect, and it's done.
Yeah.
Like, but the more you learn about React, the more you have more experience we have of a React application, the more you realize you need more granular hooks, granular APIs to deal with some kind of situation, like use layout effect,
Mhm.
use sync external. I can't remember
Yeah,
sync
sync
external
external
store.
store.
Yeah, so it gives you the power to implement more complex application, and but still you have the simple answer, which is use state, use effect,
Mm,
and it try to deal with I don't know more most of case, and then if you need more something than this, you have
yeah.
it, also have it. I
Yeah,
like
exactly.
this way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And even like here, like we're seeing, like when we see these patterns emerging, you start also seeing like what kinds of abstractions you can put on top of it. So one of the patterns we saw emerging is that, okay, we have a component which is represents a component tree. So we have a context for that, but in that context we might need some data fetching, and we might want some suspending around there, and we want some error fetching around that. And so maybe you could express these um, more in a more abstract way. Where the hell did I put my comment? Where'd it go? Oh my god, was it in here? Index. Oh, there it was. So you could say that maybe you could abstract it to something called like so branch. That would actually be like an entry, uh,
Hmm.
and in that entry you create. So this would be like the context for that entry, and then the second one is the actual component, and then you could like say maybe you have some options like suspense or whatever that will be loading, and then so you can like create these things, and it's much easier to learn about the concepts here because you say an entry has a context, it has a component, you can optionally give it suspense and an error boundary, maybe like fetch data then you like have a function for that, so you understand what does it mean conceptually to have an entry. But it has way less flexibility, but it's a good way to learn about the concept. So,
Yeah,
and I feel that itch all the time. Like developing APIs is like, oh, maybe we should have an impact dash entry package. That would be cool. But yeah,
yeah,
nice. But yeah, I think we have. I'm going to commit this, and then we'll ask Alex to join next time, and then that's going to be interesting to see what he thinks about this.
Yeah, it will. Cool, cool. Right, I have to go have lunch.
Yep. I'll do some work and then we'll meet later for live sessions.
Yeah, excited about this.
Yes, me too. Me too.
Cool. All right.
We'll talk
Bye bye.
later. Bye bye.